All right, P.A.S. report listeners, the holiday season is here. Why not make your life easy and choose design-it-yourself gift baskets? Whether it's a gift for that special someone, family, friends, employees, corporate clients, you don't have to rack your brain anymore. These gift baskets are perfect for any person. At designityourselfgiftbaskets.com, gift baskets can be fully customizable, or you can choose hundreds of pre-arranged gift baskets. Design It Yourself gift baskets are festive for the holiday season, whether it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, and you can be sure that these beautifully decorated gift baskets will make anyone feel appreciated. No matter who you're shopping for, go to designityourselfgiftbaskets.com. And best of all, you get to save money. P.A.S. report listeners can get 10% off your order using code PAS at checkout. So go to DIYGB.com, find the perfect gift this holiday season, and use coupon code PAS at checkout to get 10% off today.
Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I have another great episode lined up for you. Now, on Monday, I told you that I was going to be talking about a topic that's not getting any attention. However, I am actually pushing that back to next week because of all the developments happening in China. I want to discuss what's happening in the communist country. This has the potential to have massive ramifications, not just for China, but for the entire global community. We're witnessing the largest protests against the communist regime since Tiananmen Square. And I do not want to underestimate the significance of these protests. At the same time, we do have to temper our expectations given the brutality of the communist regime. These authoritarian governments, they know how to stay in power. But as the protests spread throughout China, we have to discuss what is the likely outcome. Will they ultimately fizzle out, or is Xi Jinping and the communist regime really in trouble? As I said, the answer to this question could have a significant impact on the dynamics in the international community and the current power structure that's going on. Over the last 2 decades, China has gained an enormous amount of power in the international community, and the balance of power has shifted. As the United States is declining in power and influence, China has been rising in power and influence. But the fact that we see these protests spread into mainland China is important, as it signifies that the people of China have had enough of the totalitarianism routinely inflicted on them. There's growing discontent, and this comes shortly after Xi Jinping consolidated power within the Communist Party and essentially became the Chinese dictator for life. You can only push human beings so far before they snap, and we may be witnessing the beginnings of a period of uncertainty as the protests spread in China. This is truly remarkable given the fact of how politically stable people thought that China was, and we rarely see these types of images coming out of a communist country. I'll explain what's going on, I'll explain the potential ramifications, and I'll explain the Biden administration's response to these fast-moving developments. I also want to discuss how the little Mussolini wannabes over here would love to emulate the communist regime, as they're at it again. They don't stop. It's so frustrating. Calling for the potential for schools to be shut down, reinstituting mask mandates. These people are sick. They are demented. We have more than enough data showing how lockdowns, closing schools, and masking inflicted enormous damage within our society, but these people don't care. The only thing they care about is power, control, and relevancy. Before I jump in, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you find the show informative, share it with your family and friends. And I also want to hear what you think, so make sure you write a review on Apple Podcasts or drop me an email, podcast@PASreport.com, podcast@PASreport.com. While the protests in China are nothing new, people need to realize that there are protests that do occur in China. The size and the scope of the current protests tell me that this is something different. China, particularly in the provinces, they routinely try to squash the protests that do rise up, especially those that represent a threat to the communist regime. However, there are a lot of misconceptions about China and the regime. People are allowed to criticize the government, and most of the protests are directed at local government corruption, not the communist regime itself. When someone pushes too far and the communist authorities believe that the comments and the protests threaten the stability of China, that's when the regime will swoop in with extreme brutality and put an end to them. Those who incite the mob are arrested. Some of them are never heard from again. Protesters return to their homes, and then they go about their daily lives. The current protests are different, though. These are protests in the major city areas, and they are directed against Xi Jinping and the communist regime itself. And that's what's surprising. We are hearing the chants of Xi to step down. We're hearing the chants of the communist regime to just come to an end. The protests are spreading in China, and that's what makes this so different. Whenever there were local protests, they usually don't last long, and we certainly don't see images of these protests. China has built and perfected the largest surveillance state in the world, thanks to many American companies, by the way. They control all information flow. They control what people can see, what people can hear, what people can say. The Great Firewall of China and the social credit system were designed to keep people in line. They want to control the flow of information to make sure any discontent doesn't spread like a contagion throughout the country. And listen, over the last few decades, when we look at China, they've made rapid advances. They've made economic advances. They've made military advances. They now have a footprint in most of the world. No matter what continent you go to, they have a footprint, including in America, where they own tons of real estate, tons of farmland. So when we look at how this country has rapidly advanced, it's actually frightening. And the communist regime rarely makes mistakes because they understand that the biggest threat to their power isn't the United States. It's not any other country. The biggest threat to their power and authority is the 1.4 billion people living in China. They understand that. I mean, the biggest mistake they ever made as far as policy goes was the one-child policy. That was one of the dumbest policies you could possibly imagine. It's created a nightmare scenario for China with the female-to-male ratio being imbalanced, especially between the ages of 16 to 35, and it's become a big problem. But you rarely see China make these types of mistakes. However, Xi's COVID strategy, his zero COVID strategy, was the most senseless and illogical policy one could think of. COVID is here to stay. Everyone knows that, and everyone's going to have to accept that fact. Most countries around the world have come to that conclusion. They've realized that we're going to have to live with this thing. However, Jinping and many of the Chinese officials, they are not dumb people. In fact, when you look at what they've done and how they've been able to develop, becoming a powerhouse on the world stage, it shows you how smart they are. So we have to ask the question, what's really going on? Does Xi and his communist Chinese authorities, do they really believe that they could achieve zero COVID in their country, or is there something else going on? Given the evidence, it's clear that the zero COVID strategy isn't about COVID at all. They know the coronavirus is never going to be eradicated from their society. They know that, especially considering that no other country is doing this policy. Like maybe, and even then it's an impossibility in my opinion. But if every country went with a zero COVID strategy, maybe you could eradicate it from the world. But you're not going to eradicate it from simply one country. It's not going to happen. And these policies, they weren't instituted for a zero COVID strategy. They were instituted to serve a purpose, to be a vehicle that allowed Xi to consolidate his power and control within the Communist Party itself, to exert the government's dominance over the Chinese people. That's what it's really about. Now, as the protests spread in China, this strategy, it may actually come back to haunt them. We may be witnessing the beginnings of that now. Usually, when it comes to situations like this, it's always about power and control. And these policies were designed to control the people of China. That's what they were designed to do. For the last 2 years, imagine being locked in your home, unable to leave. You can't even go outside to get fresh air. You can't go take a ride somewhere. You are locked in your home. You're not able to drive to visit family and friends. You can't interact with other human beings like a normal person. That's how the Chinese people have had to live for the last 2.5 years. Now, we're not talking about cities with 1 million people or 2 million people. We're talking about cities with a population of anywhere between 15 to 25 million people. 25 million. Now, when you're locked down like this, it's like a prison. It's like solitary confinement. This will drive you mad. It will drive any human being mad. Human beings are social animals. They need to interact with other people. Yet the communist regime treats them as nothing more than products of the state. Their existence is to serve the state and to obey their communist masters. That's why they exist. That's the way they're viewed by their government. You have apartment building door locks welded shut so no one could enter or leave the buildings. You have CNN reporting that gates with metal spikes were put around some buildings to prevent freedom of movement. You have children testing positive for COVID who were ripped from their parents and forced into filthy quarantine camps. Pets being thrown in sacks and beaten to death with baseball bats. I mean, when we look at what the Chinese government has done to its own people, it shows just how little regard they have for their own people, how little regard they have for human life, these communist SOBs. More importantly, it shows the sheer cruelty of this regime and why they're the largest human rights abusers on the planet. It is the exact reason why protests are spreading in China. You can only abuse your subjects for so long before they stand up for themselves, before they begin to push back. And if you know anything about Chinese culture, this is very unusual. Understand that obedience is a big part of Chinese culture. Networks and linkages are a big part of Chinese culture. We haven't seen protests of this magnitude in quite some time. What's remarkable is the images that we're getting out of China, and it shows that cracks may be forming in the Great Firewall. Remember, the Chinese government controls all information flow in the country, so the fact that word is spreading throughout the mainland shows how widespread this is and how it has the potential to serve as a contagion throughout the country. No one really knows how this is all going to play out, and there are many who are being a little too optimistic about where and how this all ends. And I'm going to advise you, remember the Arab Spring. You had a street vendor in Tunisia, tired of government abuses. He walked to the presidential palace, doused himself in gasoline, set himself on fire. That was a powerful message and served as a catalyst for the Arab Spring and uprisings throughout a number of countries in the Middle East. You had all the so-called experts in the United States cheering on the protesters. They said it was a new day and that the people were tired of the authoritarian regimes abusing their power. They were tired of being oppressed. That democracy would finally come to this region of the world. Then there were people like me who knew this was going to end in disaster. Now, I'm not an expert, but I do understand human behavior. And I do understand the Middle East very well. I do understand the North African regions very well. I understand that the concepts of liberty and freedom, and I also understand that real liberty, true liberty, is not inherent in every culture. Most people around the world would rather have stability and improvements in their personal economies as opposed to true liberty. Understand that concepts like liberty are part of the American political philosophy. They're not part of the international community's political philosophy. And I also know how the authoritarian regimes work. I know the brutality of these types of government. I understand the tribal cultures in these regions. We are now 11 years out from the Arab Spring, from when the Arab Spring started. The Arab Spring reached a dozen or so countries. How did it work out? How many of those countries are thriving democracies today? Well, the answer is zero. And the reason I bring this up is because we need to temper our expectations, especially considering the brutality of the Chinese regime, the communist regime. They've lasted in power for quite a long time, and there's a reason that they've lasted in power for quite a long time. Let's face it, in our busy lives, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. In fact, according to the CDC, only 1 in 10 Americans are eating the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day, missing out on essential vitamins, minerals, fibers, and antioxidants. And that's where Balance in Nature comes in. Balance in Nature sources only the best produce, free from pesticides, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. And Balance in Nature is the best fruit and vegetable product on the market. They use only fresh, whole fruits and vegetables inside each capsule. They don't use any GMOs, fillers, binding agents, or preservatives of any kind. I would never endorse a product that I don't use myself, and since using Balance in Nature, I feel more alert, I have more energy, my focus is sharper, and I feel great. Live life to the fullest and choose Balance in Nature. P.A.S. Report listeners can get 35% off the first preferred order. Start getting the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables you need by using code PAS at balanceofnature.com. China is already using its surveillance state apparatus to take down the agitators and to prevent new protests from popping up. And sadly, American tech companies are helping the government. You have so many pathetic and cowardly companies here in the United States who would rather bow to their communist masters to make money instead of doing what's right. And in a disgraceful move, you have Apple. They restricted the use of AirDrop on all its devices in China to prevent people from easily communicating and sharing information, including images, videos, locations, where to meet up. Imagine, this is a company that is currently threatening to take Twitter off its app store, but they have no problem with the communist regime tracking and targeting their own people. And what do you think the Chinese government's going to do with some of those that are instigating these protests? Do you think they're just going to give them a slap on the wrist and let them go? It really is shameful. You look at companies like Nike or the NBA, the ones that are so quick to criticize the United States, criticize everything about the United States, try and create a moral equivalency between the United States and China. They've been silent the entire time because they're cowards. They're all cowards. All these companies, all these people that constantly bash the United States, they should be ashamed of themselves. And you should realize the frauds that they really are. They have no regard for anything. They only care about the bottom line. That's what they care about. You now have police fanning out across the country, arresting those that they deem are inciting the protests. Keyword, inciting. I'll talk more about that later. On Tuesday, we saw tanks begin to roll into major cities in an effort to secure these cities, prevent future protests. It's reminiscent of Tiananmen Square, but the main difference is that in Tiananmen Square, it was mostly students that were protesting. These protests include grandparents, mothers, fathers, young adults, teenagers. Think about what I said before. The communist regime is much more worried about the 1.5 billion people living in that country than they are about a country like the United States. Much more worried. Because they know that's how they're going to collapse. That's how it's going to end for them. We have to recognize, though, that the odds of these protests toppling this regime are not all that great. In fact, the odds are stacked against the protesters. And it's important that we're honest about that. Others are asking whether this is the end for Xi Jinping. There is a possibility that the Communist Party can fracture here. And remember, in the communist system, it's supposed to be about the party as opposed to one man. I mean, think back to the Soviets. Sure, you could remember Joseph Stalin, you could remember Khrushchev and Gorbachev, but there were a lot of Soviet leaders that most people could never recall, that they don't even know the names of. Okay, and that's the way it's supposed to be in communist regimes. In a communist system, when one person becomes bigger than the party, it can represent a threat to the Communist Party. So we can't dismiss the overthrow of the Xi regime. It is a possibility. Unfortunately, the reality is that Xi has consolidated his power to a large degree over the last several years, where many of those who once posed a threat to Xi, who may have opposed him and his radical attempt in this zero-COVID strategy, a lot of those people have been purged, either placed on house arrest, they haven't been seen in a while, so who knows what happened to them. The most recent example was just a few weeks ago, and I talked about it on this podcast, where you had the Communist Party hold its gathering to anoint Xi in his third term. As the gathering was coming to an end, you had Hu Jintao, the former president of China, being escorted out. We know why he was being escorted out. They said it was because of health reasons. He wasn't feeling well. But no, it was because he represented a threat to Xi's power. That's what it was all about. And those loyal to Hu Jintao, they're probably paying a heavy price right about now. You know, over a year ago, there were whispers that there was some fraction in the Communist Party, that there was some that felt that Xi's zero COVID strategy was hurting the economy too much and it wasn't worth it and they needed to push it back. Well, unfortunately, those people have been marginalized. It's a sad thing. So while infighting in the Communist Party is certainly a possibility, and we could see Xi forced from power, forced to step down, I do believe the odds are low that that actually happens. With that being said, the political instability in China can work to our advantage here in the United States. China is obviously our main competitor. They're the only ones that could really challenge us on the world stage. Over the last 3 decades, they've made remarkable gains. They have gained an enormous amount of power and influence in the international community. They made smart moves, smart investments. The Belt and Road Initiative is pure genius when you look at it from a political science standpoint. You look at how China has used its money to basically bully other countries and dominate in other countries and take control of their critical infrastructure. So they made a lot of the right moves while we made a lot of dumb moves. However, the more destabilized China becomes, the more power they lose. And since power is a zero-sum game, if a country loses power, that power's got to go somewhere. Now, naturally, as their main competitor, we could increase our power and influence in the international community if we play our cards right, if we do things the right way. Unfortunately, I don't have too much faith in this administration that that's going to happen. But understand, it doesn't come without consequence. And we have to say that. Let's say, hypothetically, all hell breaks loose in China. Let's say the country erupts into a major rebellion revolution. This would wreak havoc on the supply chains that are already seeing major problems. Understand, during a revolution, people aren't waking up saying, okay, even though there's a revolution going on, I have to go to work and make products for the American people and for the rest of the world. That's not the way it works. China produces a lot of goods that we use here, and this will be particularly devastating for a variety of goods, including goods like Tylenol, right? Generic medications. It's a disaster. You would think that we would have learned our lesson of dependency during the pandemic. I mean, half of the members of Congress actually brought it up. You would think that they would have passed a law that would have expanded manufacturing capabilities here in the United States, especially for life-sustaining products like prescription medications. But no, they haven't done a damn thing. And I'm talking about both Democrats and Republicans. And then you have this feckless leadership within the White House, completely unprepared for this. and they're caught flat-footed. You had the State Department spokesperson, retired Admiral John Kirby, come out and state that the Biden administration's policies towards the protests spreading throughout China is that the protesters speak for themselves. That's what we said. Can you imagine that? I mean, here, we sit here and we get involved in every single country's affairs. Anytime a country does anything, we're so quick to jump on top of them. But when it comes to China, no, we can't criticize them. We have to be careful. We have to walk this fine line. You had Chinese officials in the first meeting with top-level officials with the Biden administration. You had a Chinese delegation. You had the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. You had the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, getting raked over the coals by their Chinese counterparts, where their Chinese counterparts were slamming the United States, calling the United States a racist country, saying that we abuse human rights. They made a mockery of this meeting. They made a mockery of us. And what did Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan say? Well, we have our problems and we're not without fault, but we always seek to do better and create the more perfect union. Instead, what they should have said was, no, you don't get to dictate to the United States about human rights. You don't get to dictate to us. We're not on moral equivalency here. We don't have a level playing field here. That's what they should have said, but they didn't. And we get the same response now from this White House going towards China. It truly is disgraceful. It's pathetic. They show no strength whatsoever against the most brutal regime on the planet. But then again, what do you expect? What do you expect from these people? Many of these people actually envy the surveillance state and the social credit system China built out over the last 2 decades. Many of them would love to do the same thing here. They would love it. And they're working towards that, right? I mean, just look at what's going on with Elon Musk right now. He's being investigated by the government. You have Twitter that was knowingly censoring information, politically targeting conservatives. You have Facebook colluding with the White House. You have the FBI colluding with all the social media companies, Twitter and Facebook. And yet Elon Musk is the threat? No, they're the threat. Let's talk about the little Mussolini wannabes here in the United States. They're out in full force once again. Love to emulate their communist masters. You know the types I'm talking about. These are the people who completely ignored the Constitution for the last 2.5 years. The ones who said the Bill of Rights never came into consideration when they ruled by decree, and that the Bill of Rights was above their pay grade. These are the officials that disregarded any type of debate when it came to the draconian decrees that they mandated on us. These are the same people that completely bypassed state legislative bodies, the same people that abused emergency powers to an extent that they were never intended to be used for. And they're at it again. Over the last several weeks, I've been hearing grumblings about the increasing cases of RSV virus in kids and the flu virus. There are reports RSV hospitalizations are up nearly 300%. Cases of flu hospitalizations are up 15%. And because of these increases, you now have the mask Nazis out in full force calling for a return of masking up, threatening that schools may need to close. I'll tell you right now, I am done. If you think I'm masking up my kids again, you got another thing coming to you. I warned because of how compliant so many people were, because of how many people just silently obeyed even though they knew it was wrong, even though they disagreed with the policies, they just went along with it. Because they didn't want to cause trouble. They didn't want to be the outsider. They didn't want to be the one to rock the boat. I warned that this would happen. The flu and RSV are annual viruses. They have been with us for centuries. We never, ever universally masked up for these viruses prior to the coronavirus. But because of the number of people who obediently masked up during the coronavirus with no pushback, I warned how there were some officials who want to normalize the mask, who want to use masks anytime they can. I warned that these power-hungry officials enjoyed the relevancy and the control. And I warned that cloth masks, surgical masks, they do nothing to protect you from the viruses. This is what's so mind-boggling. I did so many podcast episodes on this. I linked to well-established studies proving just that. And these studies were all conducted prior to the coronavirus. They were all conducted prior to the politicization of masks. Understand, I was in emergency management. We did pandemic planning. We discussed masking. We discussed the impossibility of universally masking. It didn't make any sense. It was all about focusing the resources on those that are most vulnerable and giving hospitals what they need in order to handle the hospital surge, the patient surge that they're going to see. Now, some are calling for a return to masks, yet they don't even see their own stupidity. Actually, they see it. They just don't care. That's what's frustrating. And you know the media is never going to call them out. They'll never call them out. It's funny because all these so-called people who claim to follow the science never ask some really simple questions. Like one question I have is, don't you find it odd that we're seeing spikes in the flu and RSV now? Think about it a second. They're saying that we're seeing the spikes now because less people are wearing masks and gathering. But wait a minute. If the masks were able to stop flu and RSV, where we had virtually no cases over the course of the last 2.5 years until now, well then why didn't they stop COVID in its tracks, right? We still saw a surge in COVID cases. So I guess the mask didn't work for COVID, right? But it worked for the flu and RSV. That's so weird. You know, it's almost as if the flu wasn't even in existence over the last couple of years. All of a sudden it reemerges now. Could it be that most of the flu cases over the last 2 years were declared COVID cases? Now, I don't have the answer to prove it. I don't have the evidence to show you. But it's certainly worth asking that question, and the same holds true for RSV. You know, it's mind-boggling. Again, I'll say it again. For those that have a very difficult time of understanding things, they say that masks prevented flu and RSV. But if that's true, then why did COVID still spread? Why? That doesn't make any sense to me. The flu particles and the coronavirus particles are the same size. If masks stopped flu and RSV in their tracks, it should have done the same thing for COVID, shouldn't it have? So it's all BS. And is anyone going to ask whether social isolation made us more susceptible to routine viruses that we normally face every single year? The constant sanitizers and disinfectants that were killing the good bacteria? Not being exposed to certain types of infections? The reality is that we need to be exposed to some degree. We have to build strong immune systems. You know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. The fact is, cloth masks and surgical masks provide no protection when it comes to aerosolized viruses. It may prevent globs of spit and snot, but it ain't going to stop transmission and actually causes more harm. I will say it clearly for everyone to understand. Masks are unhealthy and they're unsanitary. If people swab their masks and put it in a petri dish, you would be disgusted at the bacteria that grows on that petri dish. Then you have the issue of people wearing masks repeatedly without throwing them away. With surgical masks, you have to worry about the microplastics. And guess what? Most people were never told that the FDA recommends that surgical masks be worn for a maximum period of 4 hours. Instead, it's just put that thing on your face and nobody's going to bother you. We'll accept it. Even though when you wear it longer than 4 hours, it's actually harmful to you. If you touch the mask, if you get the mask wet, if you wear it longer than 4 hours, the mask becomes compromised and you begin to inhale those microplastics. And guess what? We now have studies showing microplastics for the first time deep in the lungs. Now, I will say this about this study. When you read this study, it never actually links to masks. It never even brings up masks. It says that the microplastics are deep in the lungs because of all the microplastics in the everyday products. That is a bunch of nonsense. Just use your brain. It's not that hard. People have been masked up for about 2 years, and all of a sudden, for the first time, we're finding microplastics deep in the lungs. Gee, I wonder why. And I will not be surprised at the significant long-term damage that was inflicted on all of us with these dictatorial decrees. Oh, but masks have no impact on your overall health. Your breathing doesn't change. Your oxygen levels stay the same. Look at me. I'm going to put a 5-second YouTube video out of me jogging with an oxygen meter on my stupid finger. Anyone who tells you that is a moron. Okay, your breathing does change. It's not natural to have something covering your nose and mouth. You are using more energy to breathe. Your body has to work harder. That's, again, common sense. You don't need to be a doctor to figure that out. You don't need to be a scientist to figure that out. And any doctor that's advocating stuff like this, they should be ashamed of themselves. We know children born during the COVID era have lower IQs than those born pre-COVID. Gee, I wonder why. Can't possibly be because of the social isolation, right? It can't possibly be because children were masked up. We know masks significantly impacted children with speech issues, delayed development of our children. We know that schools throughout the United States are witnessing an explosion in behavioral issues. We know mental health issues like depression and anxiety have exploded in children, teens, and young adults. The damage inflicted due to senseless policies like universal masking is criminal in my opinion. Let's be honest, it was all for show. I will say it over and over again. It was all for show. You could wear the same damn surgical mask for friggin' 6 months. As long as you had it on your face. Doesn't matter if the surgical mask was actually doing a damn thing. Now, I couldn't take the mask. I despised them, I'll openly admit it. In the fall of 2020, I was like done with the masking. So I decided to get a cloth mask. But the cloth mask I got actually had a bunch of holes in it. If you slightly just stretched out the mask a little bit, you can actually clearly see through these holes. It was a joke. And when I walked into a place and they told me I had to wear a mask, I put it on and no one said a peep as long as it was on my face. That's all that mattered. And that's how you know it was all for show. They didn't care about whether the mask worked or not. They cared about whether you were being obedient. Listen, you want to wear a mask, wear an N95. It really is that simple. If you are wearing an N95, you have some level of protection and you don't need to worry about what's on my face. You do you. I won't criticize you. I mean, unless you're driving alone in your car with an N95 or any type of mask. That to me is just ridiculous. But if you want to wear an N95 mask because you need the protection, you have a compromised immune system, you have, several comorbidities, fine. Use an N95. Just leave me and my kids alone. That's all I'm telling you. Don't start mandating this crap. All these little Mussolini wannabes should never be anywhere close to power because they prove that they are nothing more than totalitarians. They don't care about facts. They don't care about science. They don't care about the Constitution. For God's sakes, you even have them talking again about the potential to shut down schools, even though we know how catastrophic that was to learning, development, and overall mental health. We've destroyed an entire generation. We've decimated them. We now have the results. Proficiency levels have dropped dramatically for the first time in 30 years at historic lows. This is on top of standards being dropped over the course of the last 30 years. So it's even worse than the numbers in the National Report Card actually show. But the Mussolini wannabes, they don't care. They only care about power, and they want to dictate to everyone else how to live their lives. Remember, many of these same officials in the United States, they lauded China's response to the pandemic. You had newspaper outlets like NBC talking about how we should be adopting the Chinese COVID response model, how China outsmarted us, how they did such a better job than us. We had over 1 million deaths. How many deaths did China have? And that's China's excuse today. They released a statement the United States shouldn't criticize them because we let our 1 million people die of coronavirus, where they saved how many people from dying of the coronavirus? No, they just starved them to death. They tortured them to death. They drove them crazy. Yeah, so much better it worked out for you. Morons. Yet people like Lord Fauci, the embodiment of science himself, openly stated that China's response was far better than ours. He stated that a year and a half ago. Maybe someone should ask him what he thinks now. A lot of the frauds love the totalitarianism of government. And I brought this up in previous podcast episodes. It was a piece written by Harvard law professor Jack Goldsmith and University of Arizona law professor Andrew Woods. And it tells you everything you need to know, where they argue, quote, in the great debate of the past 2 decades about freedom versus control of the network, China was largely right and the United States was largely wrong, as significant monitoring and speech control are inevitable components of a mature and flourishing internet, and governments must play a large role in such practices to ensure that the internet is compatible with societal norms and values, end quote. What do you think they're talking about? They're talking about building Great Firewall here. They're talking about controlling the flow of information here. They're talking about doing exactly the same thing that the communist regime of China does. That's what they're talking about. That's the mindset of these people. And I will continue to remind you of that. Just think about the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism that I've spoken about often, more than anyone else. Think about how those expressing quote-unquote anti-government, anti-authority sentiment can be labeled as domestic terrorists. They never define what anti-government, anti-authority sentiment is, but if you just take a look over in China, you're seeing anti-government, anti-authority sentiment by people protesting. Think about how many times they use the word incitement throughout the document, that what you say, what you post can lead to incitement, therefore you could be declared a domestic terrorist. And think about earlier how we used the word incitement, because that's the exact word that the communist regime uses. Take a look at China and how they use similar language, and it's revealing. It shows you everything you need to know. And as the protests spread in China, maybe we should begin reacquainting ourselves with the concepts of true liberty and freedom. Maybe we should read the Constitution and understand why our founders believed in limited government. Maybe we should understand why they implemented safeguards like the separation of powers and checks and balances. Maybe we should actually understand the Bill of Rights. and the importance of the Bill of Rights. We need to better understand the core American political philosophies. Don't be so willing to trade your liberty away for the illusion of safety and security, because all you have to do is look at communist China. Look at what's taking place there now, and you do not want that coming here. Now, I hope you found the content of this episode informative. I appreciate all the 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts, and if you have 30 seconds, please write a good review. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.